1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Giuseppe Vaira of the GD Vajra estate in Piedmont. The winery was founded by Giuseppe's parents, Aldo and Milena, and is run in the second generation by Giuseppe and his siblings, Francesca and Isidoro. The winery is located in Vergne, in the commune of Barolo, and the family also grows wines under the Luigi Baudana label in the commune of Serralunga in the eastern section of the Barolo production region, as well as producing their Monterustico wines from the historically revered Dolcetto vineyards of Dogliani. We talked about monks, anarchists, and how a splash of colour lets you see life in a new light, nascetta, slarina, chateaus, and giving airplay to the heirlooms, the spirit of 68 and a teenage exile on the family farm, sacrifice and sharing in an increasingly selfish world, car rides with the old guard and an invitation to the universe of ideas, how the Tanaro River and a tiramisu of soils are a recipe for sub-regional differences, recasting tradition, modernity, ashes and fires, the juxtaposition of calm facade and inherent drama in the Piedmont personality, and how wine can lead us out of dark times. I started by asking what life had been like as a Barolo boy, albeit just a little one.
I was born 1985, first of 3 kids in a farm, actually born in the very initial farm where my family is from. And that's where we lived until I was 5, and then we moved to our parents' new house. I was thinking about it earlier, and I think it was a very happy upbringing, a very simple one. For the longest I can remember, just to give a couple of very maybe personal memories, but we didn't have lamps in the house, right? Because mom and dad were starting the farm, everything got reinvested into it. So even when we moved to the new house, it was kind of very, very simple. Books were lined up on the floor for a few years before we could put sort of a library. But I would say a simple happiness. That's how I would summarize it. I think I was also a rather maybe brainy kid. Sometimes I'm a bit scared because people say that when you grow old, you kind of go back to how you were as a child. And I'm a bit scared of how I might look like when I'm 70, because I think I'll be stuck in books. And I was a very avid reader, maybe rather precocious reader.
Right, what kind of stuff? Were you reading fiction or?
A lot of old school Italian fiction novels. So what happened is that when I was 5 and we moved, my parents had this odd decision not to take the TV with us. And in order to balance that, we had no budget on books. And it was a lot of books we would just borrow from the school library, and others we would have permission to buy. And I ended up reading all of these sort of fiction writers like Jules Verne and Emilio Salgari. And it was incredible stories. And that was the beginning. And then, of course, many others. And then a lot of outdoor playing. We would camp in the farmyard over summer. It was usually a very, very bad idea. By 3 a.m. we were like drenched in the humidity of the night and like regretting it. But the sense of adventure and just the desire to do it would always win. And so inevitably, after a couple of weeks, we were back to try and camp. And that was it. I think another memory that contributes to that sense of happiness, I remember after hailstorms. I would always go to my dad. Hailstorms are a big thing in Piemonte. Every year we got hit one way or another. And I remember going to him and asking him, like, how bad was it? Because I was too young to judge, and I needed, I guess, a confirmation we would overcome it. And I always remember my dad being somewhat hopeful. This is something that worked under our skin very gently, but a sense of patience and embracing of the work, where we never saw them angry or desperate. And you could tell some hailstorms had been harder than others, both by looking at the nature and looking at their face, but we never saw them not having a hope and a desire. And so, yeah, these are just some sketches.
Yeah, and you were very into your football as a kid. Was that ever going to be a serious thing? Did you want to be a professional player? Were you pretty good at it?
Well, I guess it's inevitable. You want to be a professional player when you like a sport and you dream of it. But in all honesty, it was quite evident I was not a technical player. I did manage to have a good run. And I think there was a lot of like hard work and like devotion to the team and also will to embrace the sacrifice. And I was a good stopper, but definitely very bad feet. So anyway, it was quite clear from an early moment that I would have not had a career. But I still cherish those memories. I think it was a great school of life, learning how to play in a team, supporting your teammates, giving it all for the squad. That was fantastic.
And did Issy play as well?
Yeah, and definitely he had better feet than me. He's always been a very good player. And then he moved to rugby, which was quite a rare circumstance.
Yeah, right. Were you competitive with each other as children? What was the dynamic between you and Francesca and Isidoro?
I think we were in a very normal dynamic. I wouldn't say overly competitive, but definitely siblings, and still is true today. Like, we're very unfiltered when it comes to telling things to each other for the good and the bad of it. And definitely, I think growing up gave us a new layer of like respect and gratitude of each other and being together and working together. So yeah, I would say just a very normal dynamic. You grow and you kind of appreciate more of each other, and maybe also a little distance created by going to college, coming back gives a whole new perspective. But it's definitely true that when there is a battle, whether it is climatic or circumstance, it's incredible how we feel united. And then you do get to argue, but you argue in the easy times, right? And when there is a challenge, you feel a sense of union that is unmatchable.
And you mentioned your love of camping in the summer. I'm sure you guys got roped into quite a lot working in the vineyards during harvest. I don't know if all of your friends were in similar situations, but did you enjoy the work that you got to do for the family when you were kids, or did you find it a bit of a chore?
I think I'm enjoying it more now than what it was. Now, we grew up in a very peculiar moment where some kids of our age were very much still belonging to a rural world, and they ought to work. And then we had also schoolmates who were living more of a urbanized life, although we were living in small villages, and so they would have a ton of free time and leisures, and we were somewhere in between. Like, we were not forced, but we definitely had to give a hand, and that was especially true when I was 15. According to my parents, I was maybe playing too much soccer, so that's how I got to play my first vineyard. They just told me, be up at 5 tomorrow, we're going. And when I think of it now, I have an incredible gratitude. For a start, for me, was the chance to start working with an older generation of local farmers, most of them being retired today. There was a lot of learning, a lot of little lessons. You did feel it was a bit of bad luck that you had to go work, whereas your buddies were maybe sleeping in and having an easy day and maybe going to the pool. But I think those months of summer work really shaped, and I wouldn't do it any other way. Like, if I had a choice, I would do it again. And when I think of our children, with Sophie, my wife, we can't wait for them to be at work, because I think no matter what they'll choose is good. It's a good thing to learn to work at a young age.
Well, speaking of working at a young age, 15, I believe, is the age your father was in 1968 when he got in a bit of trouble for protesting during what was a heady revolutionary European era of 1968, and got sent essentially to the farm to go and work at age 15 and got an incredible amount of experience and work done. How much of that formative era of your father's going back to the land fed into both your experience but also the generation of what's become the family estate?
When you talk to my dad, about 10 years ago, I heard him once saying he almost regretted not having parents who were in farming. And I think he says that because in that moment it was evident to him how much he had to learn from scratch. And so maybe he saw that as a bit of a disadvantage. But honestly, I think we have a tremendous wealth of experience that came by the fact he had to learn it all. And he was humble and wise enough to seek for help. Just to give a little example, when you tend the vines, you don't really bring the shoots straight up. You want them already looking into the following season, right? You want them with a little angle because you're already thinking of the pruning you'll do next year. Now, this is things you only learn from an old generation. And I think there's plenty of those little nuances that he got to learn, sometimes out of being taught and other times out of trial and error and making mistakes and going back to it and figuring it out. And I think this is a gift to us. But what really strikes me is that oftentimes when something happens, I think he's always keen to tell us not to get stuck in the mud. Meaning, I think he looks back at those days where little things seem to be gigantic. And in hindsight, he's like, you know what? There's so much more beautiful things out there that we shouldn't get stuck into the little nasty days.
Yeah, and just to clarify, because I suppose the generational thing is perhaps a bit confusing, but the estate is named after Giuseppe Vaira, your father's father. But your father's experience originally was with his grandparents.
Correct.
And so that was, I think, a tiny, 0.3 hectares?
Yes.
Back in the day. So just, again, explain, I know this is before your time, but what the progression of learning and also what the vineyards of Piemonte were like when he started in 1968 as a 15-year-old.
So our story is a bit different, but in a way the pattern was somewhat a similar pattern. And it was a time when farming was being abandoned. Now, in the case of my family, my grandparents had moved to Torino, emigrated to the capital of the region right after World War II. They were the first family to make that move. My grandfather stood up against fascism during the war, so people stood for democracy, were called on duty. It was a no-brainer to accept a job offer from the Ministry of Defense. I could propose to my grandmother, get married, move to the city, and they had a dream to raise their family in a booming environment with better education, better possibilities for their kids. But when Aldo, my dad, went back, pretty much it was the time when people were at large trying to make a move away from farming. So the family just anticipated a trend that actually happened in the following 20, 30 years. Now, why was that happening? On the one hand, farming was going through a very challenging phase. Especially we had 7 years of continuous hailstorms in the 60s that had really put farming on its knees. And meanwhile, the social contrast with the city was exploding. Torino particularly was a magnet for people all over Italy. It was the most industrialized city. Fiat was in a booming phase and attracting literally people from every other region in the country. That was the context. Now, within the family, we had kept this farm. My nonno, my grandfather, was orphan of his mom. And so the farm was all what he had, and pretty much his only memory of his mother, and had been assigned or given to sharecroppers to farm. And my father's grandfather, Carlo, was still making a little wine for the family. And apparently he was a very precise taster. He tasted so many times. He would be told that if he tasted the wine one more time, there would not be enough for the rest of the year. But anyway, that's one of the initial memories. But when that went back, there were literally 3,000 square meters of vineyards still farmed. So viticulture was marginal at the time. Farms were a mix of vineyards, but every farm had to have cattle and fields. Irrigated fields were the most pricey. In a way, vines were what you would do on the hillside because they were too dry to grow cereals or other crops.
Okay, and what grape varieties would he have been working with then, and when did Nebbiolo become more of a part of the puzzle?
Well, definitely those were days when Dolcetto still had a much higher reputation. Beppe Colla, a great winemaker of those days, once said that if you check the veins of Piedmontese folks, you would find more Dolcetto than blood. And I think it speaks of a respect and a reputation, just a consumption that was there for Dolcetto. Barbera didn't have the reputation that grew to have later on. Nebbiolo was definitely the oldest variety, but in those days not really living a moment of fame as we see it today. So farms tended to have pretty much equal amounts of Dolcetto and Nebbiolo, and maybe a little less Barbera in those days.
And fast forward then to your formative experiences on the farm. You said that you were quite an intelligent, precocious, quite bookish child.
No, not intelligent, just
Okay, I'll say intelligent then. But you were quite drawn to the sciences, and there was a bit of a toss-up over whether you were going to go and follow a medical route or end up back on the farm. So how did that tension play out? What was the advice of your father and what went through your head?
Well, I think this taps back to our upbringing. We were let free to choose, and that was special. Like, not just free, like our parents didn't care. They actually did tell us from a very early moment they were expecting us to be passionate and never be mediocre in whatever we would choose. But I think both mom and dad had to struggle quite a bit to pursue their dreams. When my dad told his family he wanted to go back to the farm, it was not an easy day. And similarly for my mom, when she told her family she was going to join my dad, there was also a bit of a shock. And just to complete on this sort of landscape, we were the only children whose parents were working together. And that had nothing to do with husband-wife relationship, but it was very, very basic risk management. If your husband was a farmer, you better have a safe job. And the only crazy couple who actually risked it all together, those were our parents. So in a way, I had many dreams. In a short, fast sequence, I wanted to be a firefighter. First of all, a carpenter, then a firefighter, then some other jobs. And then eventually was that big crossroads when I was a little older and it was time to choose college, heart surgery or winemaking. I loved that. In a way, my freedom was respected till the very last moment. Like, there was never a push or a saying. It was actually me bringing up the conversation at the dinner table the night before I had to make a choice. I asked my dad, well, what is the social purpose of wine? Because it was very evident that being a heart surgeon, you could do good to people. Way less evident what was the worth of wine to people, to life. Yes, I loved wine, and I think there is something special about sharing a bottle that is about the highest of humanity, and one of the highest things about friendship is this level of sharing, but less evident it could have an impact on life. It was the longest silence I've ever heard from my dad. It took him, I guess, maybe just a minute to think, but it seemed forever. And eventually he said, Giuseppe, if you want to say lives, go be a doctor, but look at that painting. We don't need it to live. But so as music or poetry, all forms of beauty are what elevate human life and make it different from animal life. And in a very humble form, this is food and wine. So it was an entirely respected freedom, and I love it because I think I would have not maybe chosen this life if I had been forced. I tend to rebel against things I have to do. And in this way, it was a free choice, but also a choice full of meaning.
Yeah, you've mentioned a fair bit about your father and your mother's influence on you in terms of their patience and the freedom that you were given. Tell me a little bit more about your mother. When I first went, in fact, the only time I've been to Vergne, you, I think, flew in from Singapore maybe that afternoon, and I was there with my parents and a couple of friends from England. And that was actually Milena who was showing us through the wines, and obviously a beautiful presence, and it's a wonderful way that she describes I don't know what you call it, because she loved to say that she didn't describe wine very well, and she didn't even try to, but absolutely conjured the emotion behind everything that we looked at the time. So what are those traits that your mother brings to the Vajra collective in terms of skill, but also that emotional intelligence?
I think she brings plenty of it. And although we tend to speak more of my dad, really Vajra is like a heart made of two halves, and very much Mom Milena is this piece without which Vajra wouldn't be what it is. I think what she brings is precisely what you just said, is emotional intelligence, is a big sense of hope in everything we do, a big resolve. She's a very fast driver, and that is just to say, like, she's feisty when it comes to doing things, but then she's also incredibly sweet and welcoming, and it shows in so many ways, like the touches she has to welcome, whether it is people in the family, people in the team, or visitors, just the generosity with whom she would just, give up on her plans to be welcoming people in our life. It's amazing, and I think is the softest but most powerful element of all what we do.
Let's home in on Vergne itself and the vineyards. First of all, just geographically, give us the lie of the land of exactly where you are in Barolo.
If you could look from 100 meters above, we are on the very far west of the Barolo region. Vergne is a small hamlet just west of the village of Barolo. So historically, that was the western frontier of the region. end of the designation. The MGA got expanded around 2005. So there's now higher elevation vineyards, more western elevation vineyards. But a century ago, that was it. That was the frontier. It looks like a promontory when you drive up in a day in the fall, down from the village of Barolo itself. The valley is already in shadow, and you have this windy road up. Once you get to the top of the hill, which is where Bricco delle Viole is located, you still see the sunset. So that promontory has as a feature of like just receiving a lot of light, and then windier evenings and a big drop of temperature. The village itself is very small. When everyone is home, I think it doesn't reach 100 people. It has changed from when I was a child. There are now more homes. It used to be even more rural back then. Now you find a couple of bed and breakfasts that did not exist, and a camping that did not exist. But in a way, it has not lost its charm of like being a place where people are just happy and children are free.
Yeah, in many senses, to me, it's an incredibly calm place. I mean, it's just so beautiful, and there's something about the Alps in the distance and the hills and the fog and the beauty of the architecture. But in many ways as well, it's quite dramatic. I think the wines are hugely captivating for people all over the world, and certainly Australians, where we're having this conversation, are massively fond of Piedmont because I think the personality is extremely strong. For a calm place on the outside, it's got an enormous amount of drama on the inside, from its grape varieties, from its climate, and from those soil differences. So could you bring together those ideas of what it is behind the scenes that makes it such an exciting place to grow grapes and make wine?
When you see a storm coming, I think that gives a sense of the drama we have, because everything seems to be on slow motion, even more so than the norm. The sky starts to change color, the clouds are coming, they are incredibly dark, and yet there is a sense of like nothing is happening. You're just there and waiting. And yet it is inevitable. I mean, you can really tell those clouds are coming your way. So yes, it's slow motion, and yet somewhat there's a sense of drama and something that you just cannot avoid or escape. And I think it matches with a certain resolve of the Piedmontese people. We're not the easiest people of Italy. Maybe being surrounded by the mountains, maybe not having access to the sea, has kept Piedmontese as a bit more of a shy population. Your neighboring relationships are not necessarily the easiest, but that also has given a certain resolve to people to sort of figure it out. And so I think what makes it special for us is looking at these beautiful hills. Another element is like at this time of the year, when we have still the sun very low on the horizon, and you see this gorgeous place of like light and shadow over the hills and the rows. And I think there is an element where everything matters, every little detail, every vine, every day. People are detailed. And I think there's a sense of roots. There's a sense of like, that's where we belong. And the vineyards are small and fragmented. So everything contributes, everything suggests that you need to be into it. Then the difference that we can make is a difference of hope. Because sometimes I feel the inevitable becomes an alibi, or it can become an alibi, right? And so you can blame things for being the way they are. But I think that's precisely where we make a difference. And I think that's the touch of Milena in the whole Giuseppe Vaira thing, is that touch of like not giving up to the inevitable, but actually realizing we can make a change and we can make a difference. And therefore you work with the elements you have to let them shine, to let them smile.
It does, absolutely. And you've mentioned before, I think you've described the climate as being almost like a battlefield between those continental and alpine influences in the north, and the Mediterranean trying to fight its way into the picture as well. And also the soils, which we won't go on about too long. But again, you've described this very well, I think. We often overgeneralize, of course, but what's the neatest way, I suppose, that you can get people to picture how those soils work across the Barolo region?
I'm not sure geologists would agree with me, but I like to speak of a tiramisu accident, meaning that the soils were generated by sedimentation, so one layer over the other. This happened precisely between 13 and 5 million years ago, so relatively young soils when you look at maybe Aussie soils. In our case, it was a bowl. It was like an inlet of seawater, very tropical, full of shell life, where the compression and the rise of the Alps just started to fill this bowl with material, and that material like sedimented, and then those sediments dried out as the sea left, and the compression continued, and therefore it tilted all these layers, and so now we see them sideways, as if we could see the layers looking on the side of a cake, right? So looking east to west, we go from the oldest to the youngest soils, and precisely from the southeast to the northwest border. Therefore, you got in Serralunga what we call the Serravallian soils. In older books, you'll read Helvetian, which was the ancient name for it. And then in Barolo, we have Tortonian. And just on the back of La Mora, you have those like niche of younger soils that were sort of generated around 4 to 5 million years ago. So this gives a tremendous diversity. And I think a very overlooked element is also the position of the river. It's a tiny river. It's called Tanaro River, but it does have an influence on the weather, and I think an influence on the style of the various villages. So when you look at Serralunga, for example, that's a village that sits the farthest from the river. And I think that contributes to the dramatic element of Serralunga wines. When you look at Barolo, it sits closer to the river, and in a way the wines of Barolo do tend to have a bit more of a harmony, of a finesse that comes by, I think, also mitigation of the weather coupled with the Tortonian soils. And so these are the elements we play with. But then I think the most magic is realizing that when you walk 10 steps in a vineyard, you've already explored maybe 2 different geologies. And I think that to me is part of the magic. It's like you need to generalize in a way, but you'll never keep it straight. Like nature and life are going to always surprise us.
Because they're far more complicated, of course. So when it comes to the grape varieties, we'll talk a little bit about heirloom varieties, because there's a really interesting contradiction, I think, always with Vajra. You've already spoken about how Aldo was back in the land because of a slight rebelliousness at the time. And I think it's a streak that goes through Vajra. There's this slight counter movement, but it's not a violent one. It's always a gentle questioning of tradition at the same time as embracing it. A real paradox in what you do. And with that, you are neither modern nor traditional, and there's a huge excitement, I think, from you guys in being innovative with things from the past in a way. Tell me about your interest in those heirloom varieties, some of which almost fell into extinction.
Well, first of all, I think a definition I run into that has really caught me ever since was from Gustav Mahler, not precisely my most favorite musician, but I think he said it in a gorgeous way. He said in one of his diaries, if you love tradition, you want to keep the fire alive. You don't want to adore the ashes. And I love how it describes 2 different approaches to tradition. One is about fearing the change, right? Out of fear, you don't move. You don't change anything. You stay where you are. In a very, bad image is like a cat in the middle of the road freaking out because lights are coming. That's unhealthy, right? But then there's a tradition which is about protecting the fire, and that's way more active, is way more proactive as well. And that's the kind of attitude we love, is nurturing a respect for the past that doesn't fear and doesn't stay away from the fact that we need to contribute to it. So in part of this approach has always been about embracing the roots and the diversity. Now, it's a sensibility that I think goes back a whole long time. Dad started working on organic in 1971, most likely the first organic approach to viticulture in Piemonte in those days. And therefore, there's always been a sense and a need and a wish for diversity, whether it was the biodiversity of having cover crop in a time when it felt like you were lazy if you had grass in the vineyard, or whether it was nurturing a selezione massale of dolcetto for Coste Fossati. This sensibility has always been there. But in recent years, we've also been able to enjoy the results of a lot of work that has been done by our local university, and particularly by Professor Anna Schneider and Stefano Raimondi, who are the ampelographists of Università di Torino. They've been working and seeking and learning, and eventually they are the people who really gave a major push to some of the heirloom varieties we're growing today. In the field of white grapes, Nascetta was actually rediscovered in the village of Novello by the local winemaking community, but it was through the work of Anna Schneider that the grape got named and everything started. and they started to be propagated again. And in terms of reds, I think we're working with a couple of very exciting grapes, at least for us. One is called Slarina. The name suggests it comes from Cinerina, because the grapes are so full of wax that they look like ash. And that would be the meaning of Cinerina.
Right.
They're color like ash. And the other one is Nebbiolo di Dronero, or called Chartreuse. But anyway, these are all grapes that were not replanted after phylloxera because they tend to be very low yielding. But we do believe that with climate change, they might have something to say to today's viticulture. And they're also very fun taste-wise and unique.
Yeah, before we go a bit more mainstream, quote unquote, we'll just look at Fresa as well, because that's a really interesting grape. Not exactly the first name on everyone's lips, but those who believe in it really love it. How important is a grape like that, celebrating it and reviving people's interest in its singular beauty to you?
I think that's a good example of like working for the mainstream or working for a belief. When you look back 30, 40 years ago, Fresa was pretty much in everyone's vineyard. Literally every vineyard, every family had some Fresa. And when you look at today, is a handful of us who are still farming it. Now, I cannot blame, and I respect everyone and everyone's choice, and I cannot blame people for giving up on Fresa. But I think the taste of growing some Fresa today is the taste of like looking at a plant that is so proud and yet so fragile. So proud that is like hundreds of years old. It shares noble genetics with Nebbiolo. It's the closest offspring of Nebbiolo. We initially thought it was a parent to Nebbiolo. We now believe it's an offspring. But in a way, it's also so fragile. And it's fragile because it has long stems, so the fruit is exposed to weather, which is why people gave up. Is like a lot of hard work and then very low yields. It's also fragile because it looks like you have to give your love and your devotion to this grape. So the joy we take into farming Fresa and making wine out of it is priceless. But I think you have to look into this perspective. If there is an element of passion, you don't care what is mainstream. You just know there is a reason in pursuing and protecting these varieties. But it really turns into a bit of a mission. You don't just do it for a business thing. You do it because it's, for us, the right thing to do.
Well, then, I said mainstream, but it's not really the case, is it? Dolcetto, in some ways, has been treated as a bit of an ugly duckling by some, but obviously it's a beautiful grape and it has history, as you said. Also here in Australia, Dolcetto's enjoying quite a few different iterations that are really nice to drink in lots of different areas. Tell us a little bit about the grape variety, growing it, and where you see its charm and how Vajra tries to show that charm in the wines.
Well, Dolcetto, I think the first charm is visual. Dolcetto is flaming in the fall. It's the only variety that turns red. Nebbiolo and Barbera having more of a sort of yellow-orange hue. But when you look at those flamed colors, that is Dolcetto. And in springtime, you see those little coppery hues on top of the foliage, and it just has its own personality from the start. It's sturdy, shoots grow up steady, and doesn't fear the wind, but is like a princess. Don't try to neglect attention, or you'll pay the price. And what I mean by that is that traditionally Dolcetto was grown on top of the hills where the soils are more delicate, more calcareous. And part of the problem we see with today's reality is that when Dolcetto was ripped out of the historical positions and planted into lower elevation sites, which tend to have a bit more clay, it really suffered. And so that is one element. If you allow me, this might be something I have not said so explicitly before, but Dolcetto reminds me of our third daughter. We had a very special moment in the house when our youngest was born. This was back in 2021. Her name is Teresa. Mia, who back then used to be the youngest and no longer was, had a moment of like rebellion. And she was very young, and for a whole week I was fighting with this little kid. I was telling her, go brush your teeth, and she would rebel. And after a week I realized it was not about brushing teeth. It was a desire of attention. And I realized that because I told one night Mia, I was so tired of arguing with my daughter. I was like, Mia, please. I was begging her, I come with you, let's go brush your teeth. And she put the biggest smile all week. So it was not about the toothpaste or the toothbrush. It was about someone looking at her. And I think this is dolcetto. When you remove that love from dolcetto, when you expect it to behave on its own, it doesn't work. I guess this is a life truth, but it's very true with this variety. The beauty when you start caring about dolcetto is that it can be a vibrant expression. It can be a red wine that provides energy. Instead of calming, it gives you a sense of brightness, the tartness of the tannins, the lower acidity. These are all elements that sort of are unique, but they do need care or they won't work on their own.
Okay, moving on, Barbera.
Barbera is a beautiful grape that is giving me plenty to learn every year. Like, you think you know it better, and then you realize you still have plenty to learn. You think it's easier, and then you realize it's not really the case. You think that, oh wow, it has high alcohol because it's a modern day thing, it's a situation with farming and climate. And then you read in books that back in the 1700s, people were already describing Barbera for being full of spirit, which was their way to say it had a higher proof. And so I'm still learning about it. But in general, I think what I love about Barbera is when it carries a bit of that brighter acidity and that energy and that kick, and I think it makes it very Piedmontese. And while it is maybe the most cosmopolitan of our varieties, the one that is more easily understood by people, I love that it carries a spine of acidity and something that is just very, very Piedmontese and like sort of alpine and Nordic.
Beautifully fresh. Nebbiolo, of course, has become so important. It wasn't necessarily as much at the forefront of people's minds when your father started out, but now obviously has been catapulted really to the top of the charts in the world, really, with Pinot Noir. What is it about Nebbiolo that's so special?
Farming-wise, the challenge and the risks of Nebbiolo. It's the first grape that has bud break, and it's the last we're going to pick. So it multiplies the farming risk. Also the transparency to terroir and how Nebbiolo really reflects small nuances in a magnified way. And then the mystery of it. Like it's a variety that, just to name an example, 2014 was a cold vintage, and I had all these ideas of like, let's go soft extraction, let's not mess up with the fruit too much, the vintage was cold, blah blah blah. And then I'm talking to my dad and I realized that actually Punch Down was somewhat used even more in those vintages. So it's counterintuitive to what we think to know. It's a grape that does require a bit more energy of extraction when weather is cooler, right? And for me, winemaking wise is when we have the cellar full of ferment, tasting every ferment at 6:30, 7 a.m. every morning, and just looking at how these wines are talking to us and how they have their better days and then sometimes they have their days off. And you know that's not going to be a good day to rack it. You just need to persevere and be patient, and then they come around and they blossom. It's like almost dealing with teenagers in the house where, you know, you gotta handle their temper, and our job is to let them blossom into beautiful, bright maturity.
Yeah, and we won't talk too much about winemaking, but certainly with Nebbiolo, obviously the tannins are massively important, and I think Vajra always manages to celebrate the tannins and have that imprint as part of the vineyard expression in those wines. What is it that you do to allow them to shine, but also allow them not to overwhelm other elements of the charm of the wines?
I think for a start there was a prejudice that Nebbiolo had to be massively tannic. This is not the case, and even recently a friend gifted me a gorgeous bottle of 1985 Busia by Prunotto, which was a wine made by Beppe Colla, and tasting the wine you can tell that even 40 years ago great Barolos had a sort of roundness and ripeness in the tannins. So I think it was a kind of lost in translation attitude or element where people started to think, okay, it's Nebbiolo, it's Barolo, it must be tannic or excessively tannic. This is not the case. What we do is a lot of little attentions. It starts with the vineyard and the ripening and being patient. There are vintages when we might be picking Dolcetto when some people are already picking Nebbiolo. That's not always the case, but just to say that you got to be patient with the grapes. The sorting, and in recent years also sorting out sunburned fruit and making sure you get rid of what is not ripe enough, but also what is too ripe. And then in the cellar is a lot of tasting. I I wouldn't have any other secret, so to speak, if not it was for tasting and like adapting the work we do to what the wine is telling us. The result for us is that the tannins should be there but should not be the central point. And actually they should not prevail over the aromatics and the freshness of the wine.
You mentioned the importance of tasting all the time, and it reminds me, we had Stephen Pannell on the podcast, and he was telling us very, very fondly about how his time in Piedmont with the Vajra family made him fall in love with making wine again, and also said that when he first got there, the fact that he always had a glass in his hand and was always tasting reminded your father of his grandfather, who was always doing the same. You mentioned that today. Speaking of Stephen Pannell, obviously Australian wine lovers are obsessed with Barolo and Barbaresco, Nebbiolo in general, and there are plenty of people making a very good fist of growing Nebbiolo here. There's an idea that the grape variety itself doesn't travel, but I think sometimes we get confused over whether we're talking about a grape variety or whether we're talking about a region. I mean, obviously, Barolo is so special because it is, as we've said, with its soils, with its climate, with its personalities, and with its history, a completely different scenario. I mean, a really dramatic, special, unique place. And that colours a huge amount of what we understand of great Nebbiolo. What's your experience of tasting Nebbiolo from other places, not just in Australia, but also other places in Italy? How do you feel that this grape variety could, in time, show itself to be great in lots of different places?
For a start, I don't believe in neo-protectionism. But let me phrase it differently. For a start, I feel thrilled when I taste Nebbiolo grown elsewhere in the world. I feel what an honor it is, what a beauty, how much it speaks of the passion and the respect of the people who planted Nebbiolo for the grape. So my gaze is always a gaze of surprise and gratitude and happiness. And I'm like, it's not a given. I mean, doctor didn't tell them to go mad and, and grow this nasty grape and take all the pains and all the risks for that. So for me, it's thrilling. Now, the main reason why I'm happy to be back to Australia after all these years is for the people. But then there is a second element, which is I really missed not being able to travel and taste and visit the Aussie wine scene for so long. Even today for lunch, it was an embarrassing lunch because we had like a very small bite and 3 glasses, just because it was the most we could try and taste. Anyway, the point is, I'm very keen to taste what has been evolving in these last few years, and I'm sure there's been a journey that has been accomplished. And I've tasted some very, very beautiful Nebbiolos made, both in Australia and also some efforts done in the west coast of the United States. But even when I look at Alto Piemonte and I look at Valtellina, I'm looking at, regions which are different but equally magnificent and produce wines full of emotions to me. So for me, these wines reopen a wonder and a surprise.
I mentioned to you earlier, I was listening to a podcast interview that your father gave to Levi Dalton back in 2016. He tells a lovely story of when he was given a prize by the wine writer Luigi Veronelli, and it piqued a bit of interest among some people who didn't know a great deal about who this Aldo Vaira was, including some real luminaries at the time. And he was picked up in a car to take him to Torino by Aldo Conterno, and what he didn't know was also in the car were Bartolo Mascarello and Quinto Chionetti, and they were very keen to pick his brain about what he was trying to achieve and where he was coming from and what his ideas were. And of course, for him, it started a relationship with these people who had tremendous experience. But one of the things that really struck me about that story was also that it wasn't really a technical examination that they were subjecting him to, but a very philosophical one in a way, an approach to wine and understanding of the land. I think sometimes people think it's a bit wishy-washy when we talk about ideas and philosophy of wine growing, but it feels like a very genuine thing, both for the Vaira family, but also for the influences that you've had among other people in Piemonte, that your relationship with your land and the way that you think of your responsibility to it and the way that you respond to it is an enormously integral part of it. And in the same interview, I think there was this talk about just how important it was to love it, because there'll be days when it makes it hard, when you don't know what the weather's going to do. You have lots of hail there are lots of events that probably really try your nerve and your ability to hang in there and keep growing wine. And if you didn't love it and have this sense that it was important, that patience and that resilience would be very, very hard. Tell me a little bit about how that fits with your experience of this challenge, but also opportunity of wine growing. How important is the actual universe of ideas?
I'm just going to go back for a moment, if that's okay, to that story, because it's actually a fantastic story of like this young kid who was just starting, and he's been looking at people like Aldo Conterno and the others like stars. And one day he gets the phone call from, it was 1984, right? So you would just answer your landline without knowing who was calling you. And it's basically someone asking him, is that you, Aldo Vaira? Yes. Is that you who won the prize from Veronelli? Yes. Are you going to the award ceremony? Yes. And that was Aldo Conterno inviting him to give him a ride. And of course, with Quinto and Bartolo Mascarello, as you mentioned. And just tapping into that, as you were talking, I was thinking of a gorgeous picture I've seen in the Maria Teresa Mascarello's office. I was there a few years ago, and in one shelf, Maria Teresa has a picture taken of a lunch where you see all the old guard of the producers. It was a lunch, I guess, made in the 80s. And you see Aldo and Giovanni Conterno, and you see the youngest in the crowd was Angelo Gaia. Okay, everyone else was older. It was all that old guard of great winemakers who unfortunately most I could not even meet. And you could tell that gathering, again, was not about winemaking techniques. It was a gathering of ideas. It was a gathering of like care for the land and making sure that it would be respected and that people with sort of a good ethos would come and cooperate. And I look at that picture, and every time I think of it, I think I would have loved to be in that lunch, just to hear what people were saying. And imagine someone like Bruno Giacosa. He's always been a man of very few words. So it would have been incredibly interesting to hear those people talking. So yes, ideas. Maybe the most crazy example of these was the whole barrique barrel conversation, right? It was equally a winemaking element, but also almost it became a political element. And you would have two parties fighting each other over not just winemaking, but very different ideas and politics or political ideas. Why does it matter? Or you would go and see Beppe Rinaldi, and he was maybe reading Latin literature. He didn't even study Latin, but that's what he was doing in his free time. Well, I think it taps into a more romantic and perhaps naive world, but in a way I think we cannot lose that element. And when we get too nerdy into winemaking alone, and we sort of lose sight of what's the point of wine, what is the place of wine in the world and in society and in families and in friendships, we then miss the most important coordinate. So yes, it's something we continue seeking for, and we wouldn't want a wine made of technicalities without a broader sense of life.
And you mentioned as well, when you were making up your mind over whether it was going to be medical school or whether it was going to be winemaking, there was this possibility of making things that were beautiful. Art has been a big part of the Vajra picture as well. And I know it was a very important thing for your father and for you as well to meet Father Constantino Ruggieri, who became very influential. And again, there's a story about how you used to visit and you kids would just be painting or drawing pictures for days afterwards. Tell me a little bit about how the artistic side has fed into it. I mean, both in a physical way, the art that's around you and the labels and the winery, but also that idea of an aesthetic appreciation of what you're trying to achieve and the way that you ask yourselves questions about how to get there.
I think we had a couple of encounters as a family that really define who we are. And one has been with Costantino Ruggieri, the other one has been with Gianni Gallo, who was a local artist who painted all of our classic labels, and he painted for many in the regions. You'll recognize his style in like the Bruno Rocca labels, the Vieti labels, the Marolo distillery labels, and many others. And what these two people had in common was definitely not their style of art, because Costantino was way more about the colors. He was an artist of light. I mean, we met him because of the stained glass windows. We asked him to design for the cellar. Gianni was a guy of ink and watercolors. Costantino was a monk. Gianni was an anarchist. So apparently they were different people, but what they had in common was a sincere, deep, and total sense of artistry in their life. And what they taught us is not really about the words. I mean, it's not really about many words, but it was through the dialogue of many years how they shaped us. And so these are people who changed our heart and changed our perception of what really matters. And it was through those encounters and many others. But yes, that's the value that we see. In a way, we long and we miss those friends for the freedom they've gifted us.
Another thing I've noticed over the years talking to you and your family is that a frequent metaphor is the idea of nurturing something as it grows up. The vineyards as being a little bit like young children when the vines are young, going through their teenage years into their maturity, and how that changes and how you observe them almost from a parental point of view. But also what I thought was a really nice analogy with the Barolo region as well, with the years of the Barolo boys and what you referred to earlier, that almost confrontational modernist versus traditionalist idea, but the idea that those were the teenage years where people were pushing boundaries and trying things out, and that what comes out the other side of that is growing up and having a sense that if you hadn't done that and if you hadn't pushed things and you hadn't rebelled and you hadn't behaved that way, that you wouldn't be such a broad-minded, wise adult. And I think it's apt for that idea of wine growing and the patience that you've spoken about.
It's maybe a different attitude, but yeah, I think always having that sense of time as something positive. We always look at time as, in a way, as we're victims of time, and we don't realize that it gifts us a lot. It's gifting us a sense of wisdom. That's what I mean by that metaphor of the teenage of the region. It was really a change of perspective for me. Up until the previous day, I was looking at these all 80s and 90s moment in Piemonte, like they were the good guys and the bad guys, and I like this guy better than that one. And I had my heroes and I had the people I had kind of maybe not the same amount of respect. And when I started to look into the perspective of like, hey, wait a second, everyone did their best shot. Of course, everyone picks their favorite, but everyone was out there trying to make a positive impact and make a positive difference. I think the test of the truth of that expression is that you feel a better sympathy for everyone. And there's a sense of stronger unity. Like no one is an enemy. Everything has helped. Everything has contributed. And so, yeah, I think this is our role, is learning that patience, learning that we deal with nature. It seems obvious, but we have to remind ourselves we are plunging into a world where everything is synced in a cloud, and we're not used to it anymore. If we need to replace the cell phone, we just have a cloud backup and we upload it to the new device. It's done in minutes. And farming goes all the way back to the opposite attitude of like, we gotta be patient. It seems unfashionable message, but I think I've grown to really see it's more human to have that attitude in things, and it yields more. It's more fertile in a way.
Yeah, you've been a really important ambassador for Piemonte. As I said, it's enjoying such popularity in many places around the world. It must be hard for you when you do travel with your 4 relatively young children back at home, your wife, your family, and your beloved home. How do you feel, though, about the responsibility / challenge / privilege of flying the flag for Piedmont overseas?
Well, first of all, it must be said that I feel we're lucky of belonging to a generation with many incredible people. Like I look around myself and I see many people have a ton of esteem for a lot of people who really raise the flag of Piemonte every day through the wines they produce, the work they do in the vineyards, in the cellar, and also traveling. And I think we're lucky to have the next generation coming, which is also incredibly strong. There's plenty of energy, there's plenty of new projects. I think this is a blessing for Piemonte at large. This being said, it's a struggle, having the children and traveling, seeing them growing and thinking, okay, I've been missing so many days of their upbringing. You can do it, first of all, just because of the love of someone who can be there and embrace the sacrifice for both and let you do it. And that would be Sophie, and that's my wife. And you do it because you believe that the magic of life is not that we do it ourselves. If you believe you do everything, you're trapped into a sense of almightiness, which is inaccurate. You're trapped into thinking you do it all, and you become the slave of the result in a way, and you become the slave of circumstances. And yet I believe we're called to do the best we can, and somewhat there's an example that can be passed. And this makes it easier to embrace the sacrifice, and then it makes it even happier when you're home. I think I've learned the sense of quality time and the idea that that every moment is special. So yeah, it is a sacrifice. There's no way around it. But it is a sacrifice with plenty of reasons and plenty of hope that it is meaningful. It will teach something to our children as well.
Well, sort of brings us back round to that idea when you asked your father, what is the social purpose of wine? I mean, we live in a world at the moment that isn't exactly overflowing with wonderfully happy, optimistic headlines. So what is it that you hope that wine and the wines that your family at GD Vajra grow brings to the world?
Well, I think we're at the verge of a moment when a certain sense of like, I'm drinking wine because everyone is drinking wine is past. Because we're living into a new reality of, in a way, more pronounced selfishness. And what we do is carry the torch of a more beautiful, unarmed approach to life. An approach in which you realize that gifting and giving is more important than taking. You realize that there's a beauty in a gentleness of all things, a gentleness of farming, a gentleness of how you touch on the things of life, on the people you're given. And this is something that can be an example. When you think of European history, it's not always been an easy ride. There were dark times like the Middle Ages. But if you think more accurately about the Middle Ages, it was not just all dark. There was a lot of darkness, and then there were some bright points. Think of viticulture. One of the high moments of viticulture in Europe was through the Middle Ages. Burgundy kind of was established there. The great German wine regions were established through the Middle Ages. Think about how books were copied by hand, and that's how the ancient Roman and Greek culture came to our days. So it was harder days and darker days in which small but precise places would be bright of light because they carried the torch. And I think this is maybe what we're called to do in this moment. Is not going to be easy, but is not going to be impossible. And in a way, nurturing an amazing team and together believing that this is a social responsibility today is what we do, so that it doesn't matter if it is dark out of the door. The point is that once you walk into our life, whether it is physically walking at the winery or by popping the cork of a bottle, you might make an experience of the fact that there can be brightness even in darker times. And so, yes, the headlines are what they are, but I think we would like to make every bottle an experience that the headlines are not the last word on anyone's life.
I like what you said too. It sort of echoes your thoughts of what your mother brings, the idea that it isn't inevitable. And I suppose you're always showing what's possible. And that's a far more hopeful thing.
And it's beautiful. And like, if I may just give an example of what I mean. Back in December, we shut down the whole winery for half a day to give ourselves a time of studying. We called that Vajra Advance, just because it had the sense of like moving us forward. And it was the most gorgeous half a day. We had 6 detailed presentations. It was a very nerdy moment, if you will, because we were in the details of our work. So we had presentations on farming, on winemaking. And I loved 2 things about it. One is that out of 7 presentations, 4 were run by our own team. And they were incredibly well executed. Like, I asked people in the team, like, can you bring everyone to speed about these? But I didn't check what they did. It was kind of a first for me as well. The level of knowledge that was passed, the precision of the information and the presentation, everything was incredibly great. And then, of course, we had a couple of like external professors who came and gave like bigger lectures. But the second element, which I really loved, is that one of the presentations was on aromatic molecula of different varieties. And I saw, people who don't have a technical background, who have not studied. We have an amazing guy with us. His name is Innocent. He's from Nigeria. He first came to Italy on a boat, escaping from, quite a terrible story with hopefully a happy ending. But anyway, the point is, he was so into it and participating and replying to a university professor. That is a little detail. And what made me so happy was to see the team so focused and so willed to learn. And it was a highlight, I guess, of the year for everyone. So that's how we know that the headlines are not the last word, because we see real changes in our life, in the way we work, and this is also how it's going to change the result. And I totally believe a good wine can change someone's life for a meal or a day, and that is where we start.
Excellent. One wine at a time, which you're not very far away from having your next one. It's approaching dinner time in Australia. You're heading off to St Kilda in Melbourne for dinner later on. What Australian wine do you think you'd like to pick up tonight and have a taste of? Anything on your radar?
As many as possible. No, this is the hardest question, because I would like to explore as many as I can, and I think that will be the beauty tonight.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share it everywhere. Please don't underestimate the power of these endorsements in making it possible to produce original, thoughtful work. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmerison.substack.com. But now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Patricio Garcia for the edits, and to my guest, Giuseppe Vaira. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers!